The road to revolution from British subjects to members of a new republic. Prior to the 1760s, Britain had maintained a loose, hands-off policy when it came to the North American colonies. Part of this policy stemmed from its constant involvement in wars, as well as the fact that it was a struggle to hold together an ever-expanding empire around the world. This fostered a dual sense of independence and entitlement amongst the colonists. They held an allegiance to the crown on the one hand and saw themselves as British subjects. This was even more pronounced in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War and Britain's victory in that war, something the colonists were able to take pride in. But the colonists also saw themselves as Americans to a certain extent. Though they saw themselves as British subjects with certain rights, they also embraced a sense of independence and freedom, one might say, as Americans, at least becoming Americans. But there were tensions that were emerging now between the colonies and Britain. As the last decades of the 1700s emerged, growing tensions would come about between the mother country, Britain, and the North American colonies. This partly grew out of the fact that land under the parliamentary system was tied to political representation, and land in the colonies was more abundant and easier to come by. Thus, more people were entitled to representation than was common in England. And one thing that's true of most governments, people do not like to share power. So with more land in America, more people would be involved in the government itself, and that's not something the ruling class in England was eager to embrace. Though in many ways completely at odds, the Enlightenment, which gave us science and the rule of law, and the Great Awakening, which gave us religious fervor, contributed to a new sense of individualism and a feeling of autonomy. Both movements encouraged the questioning of authority, whether religious authority, such as in the centralized Church of England, or political authority in the form of the crown or king. In the wake of the 7 Years' War, the British national debt had grown more than 13 times its national revenue. In other words, the government was spending way more than it was taking in, and that's a problem for any organization. King George III and his Tory allies decided to clamp down more tightly on the colonies as a way of reining in costs. We'll talk now about some more direct causes of the revolution, some more specific acts that were passed by Parliament and the Crown that led to revolution in the colonies. The Royal Proclamation of 1773 is one we'll talk about first. George III mandated that land west of the Appalachian Mountains could not be settled. This was to deter the costs of having to defend this land. This did not set well with colonists who saw it as their right to settle this land. Of course, as we stated earlier, the more land people own and have access to, the more entitlement they have to political rights and participation in the ruling class of government. Next was the Sugar Act of 1764, and by the way, these are not necessarily in chronological order, as you might have guessed. The smuggling of sugar and molasses to evade taxes was common in the colonies, if not rampant. In order to ensure the Crown's ability to tax this sugar, Britain lowered the tax but amped up enforcement measures. Smuggling violations would now be dealt with in vice admiralty courts, in other words, military courts, rather than in criminal courts with juries. Next, we'll talk about the Currency Act of 1764. Colonists' wealth was often in the form of commodities, whether it was molasses, sugar, tobacco, or other such products, not in gold and silver, which was the form of wealth in Europe. Having gold or silver, on the other hand, in the colonies was relatively rare. Many held wealth in warehouses with just a paper note as a kind of receipt issued as part of the documentation of how much they owned and possessed. But the Currency Act outlawed the printing of paper money. This did not set well with well-to-do farmers whose only proof of their wealth was a piece of paper. So they didn't have any gold or silver to use for trade or to purchase goods. Most important in this time period is the Stamp Act, and this is also widely misunderstood. People think it had to do with the postage stamps, like if you have ever mailed a postcard or a letter. But in fact, this was really about taxing paper goods. So this had nothing to do with postage stamps, but was a law enforcing the collection of tax on paper products. In order to demonstrate that a product had been taxed and the tax paid, an official stamp was required. Well, the Stamp Act, more than many of these other acts that we talked about earlier, really had a widespread effect on colonial society. The Stamp Act affected everything from newspaper to playing cards, anything that was made out of paper. While the Sugar Act was a way of enforcing an existing law and an existing tax on the colonists, many saw the Stamp Act as instituting an entirely new tax. And nobody likes a new tax. The effects of the Stamp Act were more widespread and affected everyone from students to lawyers, and from printers to sailors. Students needed to purchase books and paper to write on. Lawyers needed paper to write and to produce documents. Printers, of course, needed paper to print books and pamphlets and newspapers on. Sailors had very few forms of entertainment. One of them that was common was playing cards. Right? So playing cards essentially are made out of paper. Therefore, this led to more resistance throughout the colonies and throughout every level of society, every class of society. Well, the Stamp Act was met with three forms of pushback, resistance, and we'll talk about each one. First is political resistance to the Stamp Act. Political resistance to the Stamp Act came in the form of the Virginia House of Burgesses passing the Virginia Resolves. These resolves declared that colonists possessed the same rights as people in England. Now, that was a widespread feeling, almost an assumption among many colonists. However, before this time, it had not really been put into printed word or expressed in a public forum. So this was quite a radical act by the House of Burgesses, again, the ruling body in Virginia. The original language included was more radical, indicating that only the House of Burgesses had the right to tax colonists, and that anyone who disagreed would be considered, quote, an enemy to His Majesty's colony, end quote. Though this language did not end up in the Virginia Resolves, the ideas and sentiment spread to other colonies. In essence, this is the beginning of the notion of no taxation without representation. In October of 1765, 9 of the 13 colonies sent representatives to the Stamp Act Congress. The Congress professed allegiance to the Crown, but also declared that colonists were entitled to the same rights as British subjects in the home country. Most important, these rights included trial by jury and the right to one's elected representatives. In addition to political resistance to the Stamp Act, there was economic resistance. In Philadelphia, merchants convened to protest the Stamp Act and assert that they would stop importing all goods from England until the act was repealed. Other boycotts, or what were called non-importation agreements, were also discussed throughout the colonies. London merchants, fearing the boycotts, pressured Parliament for the repeal of the Stamp Act. Then there was popular protest and even violence. In Boston, a protest against the Stamp Act resulted in rioters setting Thomas Hutchinson's home on fire. Thomas Hutchinson was the lieutenant governor of Massachusetts at the time. However, he was also the brother-in-law of Andrew Oliver, who was the stamp distributor for Massachusetts. In order to enforce the Stamp Act, you had to have distributors who would go around and distribute these stamps. Hutchinson, by the way, would later become a loyalist governor of the state of Massachusetts. In other words, he was loyal to the crown, not necessarily on the side of the colonists. By November, all of the distributors in the colonies had resigned. Without the distributors, the act could no longer be enforced. The Stamp Act was repealed in 1766 as a result of these three forms of pressure. So this was quite revolutionary and effective. Right? However, it was tempered a little bit by the fact that right around the same time that the Stamp Act was repealed, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, which reinstated Parliament's power over the colonies when it came to taxation. One of the acts that I don't think gets enough attention is the Townshend Acts, passed in 1767. The Townshend Acts created new customs duties, in other words, taxes on clothing, tea, lead, glass, and other ordinary items commonly imported from England. They also increased enforcement through the creation of the American Board of Customs Commissioners, and they expanded the number of Vice Admiralty courts to crack down on smuggling. The Townshend Acts were repealed eventually, leaving all goods free of the customs, except for tea, which we'll get to in just a bit. Let's talk a little bit about how the Townshend Acts came to be repealed and the resistance to those acts by the colonists. Again, boycotts on imported goods were reinstituted, and merchants published lists of goods in newspapers with signatures pledging to support the boycotts. Got to remember that newspapers at this time were like what social media is today, or even the traditional forms of media on television. Right? Newspapers were what traveled and what spread the word and spread ideas, and in this case, spread dissent among the colonists. The broader scope of goods affected by the Townshend Acts also created more solidarity amongst otherwise disassociated groups, kind of like the Stamp Act, which affected paper products across the board. Well, this affected things that almost everybody needed. Everybody bought in some capacity, or at least wanted to buy. So another form of pushback came from women. Women collected signatures and penned editorials against the Townshend Acts. To boycott imported clothing, colonists began wearing homemade clothes. And women created spinning clubs, sewing clubs, in other words, to produce such garments. Wearing a homespun shirt, like the one pictured here, became a symbol of political protest and solidarity. In other words, unity among the colonists. Next was an event that happened which was not necessarily an act of parliament, but an act of violence by British soldiers, known as the Boston Massacre. Britain had sent troops to Boston in 1768 to tamp down protests. In March 1770, a group of protesters formed outside the Customs House in Boston and began harassing a British guard. Other British troops came to the sentries' aid, but this only agitated the crowd more. They eventually fired on the crowd and killed 5 protesters. Among them was Crispus Attucks, featured in this photo here, a freed slave and a dock worker. The soldiers were defended by a lawyer named John Adams, who would eventually become one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence and our second president. The soldiers were tried and they were acquitted. They were found not guilty. But the news of the massacre and the violence spread to the other colonies and became a rallying cry, leading to more cohesion and feelings of resentment amongst the colonists against the British, and in particular against British soldiers. No one likes to be occupied. Next came the Tea Act. I told you we'd talk about tea, and here we are. In 1773, the British government took control of the East India Company, which supplied tea to the colonies and which was deeply in debt to the government. The Tea Act was passed to allow the company to sell its tea without having to pay export taxes in England. Though this lowered the cost of tea in the colonies, which was a good thing for the colonists, they perceived this as a way of taxing them further. They also resented the idea of the East India Company, a private corporation, having a monopoly on tea imports in North America. So let's talk about resistance when it came to tea. John Hancock and Samuel Adams were leaders in what was known as the Sons of Liberty in Boston. They devised a boycott of British tea. This would include members of the Sons of Liberty guarding the docks. The plan was effective, but it did not get rid of the ships or the tea, as they had hoped. By December, the ships remained in Boston Harbor. The Sons of Liberty reconvened and planned what would become known as the Boston Tea Party. Dozens of colonists disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded the ships and destroyed 342 chests of tea. News of this spread throughout the colonies, and similar actions were taken in New York, Charleston, and Philadelphia. Women in Edenton, North Carolina, signed a boycott agreement which was published in several newspapers, and some women took to the streets in protest. In 1774, the British government passed what were officially known as the Coercive Acts, which is not a particularly warm and fuzzy name. However, amongst the colonists, these acts became known as the Intolerable Acts. The British government understood these acts of protest as rebellion. In response to the Boston Tea Party, Britain cracked down on Massachusetts by passing the Coercive Acts. These would become known as the Intolerable Acts, as we said. The Boston Port Act was one of these acts, and that shut down Boston Harbor, blocking food and other supplies. Then, the Massachusetts Government Act took control of Massachusetts and dissolved colonial government. Up until this point, political rule was somewhat shared between Parliament, the Crown overseas in England, and state and local governments here. But this act shut down that colonial government, right? Basically giving control back 100% to Britain. Another act, the Administrative Justice Act, declared that anyone accused of a crime would face trial in England, not in the colony from which they came. That did not sit well with people, right? And this goes against one of our core American values, that everyone is entitled to due process, and if you're convicted of a crime, you have a trial by a jury of your peers, of your equals, not somebody in a controlling government an ocean away. While these acts only directly affected Massachusetts, the Quartering Act went a step further, and this declared that the Crown could lodge British soldiers in the homes of the colonists. Right? Think about what that would mean if you had soldiers essentially of an outside government coming in and sleeping in your homes. I don't think too many people would be very fond of that. And that would eventually lead to the sentiment behind the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, which prohibits illegal search and seizure. In this famous painting, we get sort of a sense of what was happening and what was emerging in this period in the late 1700s, a few years before the actual revolution and the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. Here we have America not only depicted in female form, but also depicted as a Native American, which is interesting because we hear so much about all of the atrocities that were done to American Indians. And of course, all of those stories, or at least most of them, are very true. But when it came to Native Americans, this was an image that was often embraced by colonists, right? The idea that somehow there was a duality in the American identity. Yes, you were a British subject with certain rights and cultural belonging to Britain, but at the same time, you were not necessarily a person who descended or had ever been to England, right? And there was a sense of independence and an independent character in nature, right? Also, there's a growing sense of victimization here on the part of colonists, right? Seeing the British government not as fatherly figures or motherly figures, but actually as people who are violating the colonies. And so you get what amounts to almost a sexual assault here depicted in this painting. So instead of quelling rebellion and restoring order, all of these actions by the British government actually galvanized the colonies politically and led to colonists seeing themselves as unified and connected to one another. In other words, beginning to see themselves as not simply members of the crown, but something different, something new. Perhaps we could call it American, right? And this was a shift in terms of the way people saw themselves. This would eventually lead to the American Revolution, which we'll talk about next time.